Greetings, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in. Tonight, we'll be reading Marcus Garvey and the Vision of Africa starting on page 369. I am a part of a podcasting network called KWAZ Radio.
Greetings. My name is the Revolutionary Matron, and my show is called The Learning Curve. I broadcast on a network called KWAZ Radio. There are other hosts on the network I'd like you to meet.
Greetings, everyone. This is Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast, inviting you to tune in to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the Pro-Black Perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
This is D Webb with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed here belong solely to the respondent, and they do not necessarily reflect any broadcast networks, affiliates, nor sponsors. The Learning Curve is a broadcast created for the benefit of my global community. Black is a consciousness. Content is being used for our commentary, research, criticism, education, scholarship, teaching, preaching, and news reporting. No copyright infringement is intended. I will make enunciation mistakes. I will give you my opinion about the information. And if you ever ask, I will send you my source.
Greetings, everyone. Tonight, we will be reading Marcus Garvey and the Vision of Africa, the Marcus Garvey Revival, 1940 to the present. These are all commentaries in this section, and the next time we hear the voice of Marcus Garvey will be in the UNIA Declaration of Rights of the Negro Peoples of the World. Marcus Garvey, the Marcus Garvey Revival, 1940 to present. Commentary by John Henrik Clark. A revival in thinking about Marcus Garvey and his movement started about 5 years before his death. With the Italian invasion of Ethiopia and the destruction of the last sovereign nation in Africa. I am mindful of the existence of Liberia in West Africa and its pseudo-independence since 1847. But most Black Americans think of Liberia as an American colony, and this thinking is not too far wrong. Garvey's attempt to establish settlements in Liberia failed, and it failed precisely because American influence in Liberia prevented it. With the loss of Ethiopia, Black people began to revive their relation to Marcus Garvey's dream of nationhood. This revival in thinking was to continue through the Second World War and in part to stimulate the convening of the Fifth Pan-African Congress in Manchester, England in 1945. This Congress was the political incubator for a large number of African future heads of state, especially Kwame Nkrumah. With the publication of the books Black Moses, Story of the Universal Negro Improvement Association in 1962 by Edmund D. Cronin, and Garvey and Garveyism by Amy Jacques Garvey in 1963, reprinted in 1970, the new interest in Marcus Garvey went beyond the papers written by students, many of whom considered Marcus Garvey an academic curio piece. He has now become part of a new literature, Both Professor Cronon and Miss Garvey have called attention to a lot of material on the rise and fall of the Garvey movement, and the Garvey revival is now something of an epidemic. Mrs. Garvey maintains that her husband was the forerunner of the Black Power and Black is Beautiful concept for this century. Certainly, Garveyism was one of the main ingredients that helped to set the African independence explosion into motion. Miss Garvey says, let us trace the source and course of Black power to determine its effectiveness as a weapon of defense of a Black minority. I propose to do so by submitting questions sent me by a student of research on the work of Marcus Garvey. I added other questions and the answers so as to round out my subject. Here they are. Is there any connection between Marcus Garvey's teachings and the philosophy of Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X? Have Garvey's teachings been corrupted? This question can partially be answered by my quoting from a letter written by Mr. Thomas Harvey, President General of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, to the Jamaica Gleaner, November 17, 1964, in which he states, Please allow me space to express my thanks to your government for inviting us down from the Americas to attend the ceremonies in connection with the reinterment of Marcus Garvey in George VI Park. I think I am in a position to speak on behalf of Negroes in America and Canada and to affirm our belief in the sincerity and courage of Marcus Garvey as the only international Negro leader at the close of this century. He paved the way for all local leaders who have emerged since his death. Most of them were his understudies or followers who were inspired by his dynamic leadership and the universality of his appeal for justice, equality, and independence for Negro peoples throughout the world. For instance, Elijah Muhammad was formerly a corporal in the uniformed ranks of the Chicago Division. Malcolm X's father was a vice president of the Detroit Division, so Malcolm X grew up under the influence of Garveyism. Mrs. M. L. Gordon of the Peace Movement of Ethiopia was formerly an active member of the organization in Chicago. The Ethiopian Federation is also an offshoot of Garveyism. Here are some of the events that tend to support Mrs. Garvey's assumption. In 1957, Dr. Nkrumah, as Prime Minister of Ghana in their independence year, launched the Black Star Line steamship service in memory of Marcus Garvey. In 1963, Mrs. Garvey wrote and published Garvey and Garveyism, the world distribution of which brought about the renaissance of Garveyism. In 1964, Garvey's remains returned to Jamaica and reburied at George VI Park, proclaimed Jamaica's first national hero. In 1965, Marcus Garvey Scholarship for Boys was established by the government of Jamaica. In 1968, Miss Garvey wrote and published a collection of essays updating Garveyism. In 1969, Human Rights Year, the government offered a prize of $10,000 in the name of Marcus Garvey to a person who contributed most toward world peace. The award was made posthumously to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. His widow, Miss Coretta King, received the award at a public ceremony at the National Stadium. Also, the Federal Republic of Cameroon, West Africa, issued a 50 franc commemorative stamp bearing the likeness of Marcus Garvey. In 1971, the government of Jamaica issued a 10-cent stamp and a 50-cent note in honor of Marcus Garvey. In 1972, a plaque unveiled in London to mark the office where Garvey worked. Groundbreaking ceremony for Marcus Garvey East Village in Brooklyn, New York. This is part of a state urban renewal project which is being built at a cost of 11,950,000. In Jamaica, Marcus Garvey's home, the subject of repatriation is once more being discussed. In February 1972, a number of African organizations in Jamaica, West Indies, came together and formed the Joint Committee on Repatriation. The Joint Committee has since that time been working steadily to effect the return of Africans in Jamaica to their motherland, Africa. In pursuit of this aim, the committee has started a drive to collect 100,000 signatures to support a petition to the United Nations to take up the matter of repatriation of the descendants of Africans formerly held as slaves. The campaign has been well received initially. There have been good attendances at outdoor meetings, and the majority of the people giving their names for repatriation have been under 30 years of age. This shows the awakened interest of Black youth in Jamaica in their ancestral motherland of Africa. Greetings, KW Don 7. Thanks for tuning in. I appreciate you. Garveyism, Some Reflections on Its Significance Today by Marcus Garvey Jr. So this is written by his son. So many commentators writing about the late Marcus Mosiah Garvey, you have used the term back to Africa leader and have concentrated exclusively on this aspect of Marcus Garvey's thought and work, that the general reading public must be excused for thinking that there is nothing more to Garvey philosophy than packing all the blacks on boats and dumping them in the African bush. This, of course, is not an accident. The white liberals and the pseudo-intellectual blacks who have been most vocal in interpreting and denouncing Garvey adopted the same line for different reasons. The liberals have never wanted the Black race to develop strength and power in their motherland of Africa. In that case, they would be out of business. The pseudo-intellectuals, on the other hand, have always been wary of any scheme which would take them too far away from their favorite avocation, pursuit of the white female. For these reasons principally, commentary on Marcus Garvey has usually taken the form of black and white minstrel shows built around the general theme of a crazy, egotistic, and noisy black who thought up a scatterbrained scheme to remove the black people from their American paradise to the African jungle. Nevertheless, there exists a sufficient body of speeches, sayings, and writings of the late Marcus Garvey to lead us to an understanding of concrete, rational, and orderly ideas which constitute the philosophy of Garveyism. His ideology, Garvey, in his ideology, Garvey proved himself an African nationalist par excellence, and Garveyism remains today the highest form of African nationalism. Let us proceed to a sectional evaluation of the concepts. The first concept that Marcus Garvey laid down was what may be termed Black awareness, the belief that we as a race and a people must be aware of ourselves as Black men, that we must be familiar with our culture, our heritage, and our history. Black man, know thyself was his familiar and powerful injunction. He never wearied of pointing out that when our forefathers were cultured and civilized, the whites of Western Europe were howling barbarians who committed human sacrifice and worshiped the mistletoe. But when we come to consider the history of man, was not the Negro a power? Was he not once great? Yes, honest students of history can recall the day when Egypt, Ethiopia, and Timbuktu towered in their civilizations, towered above Europe, towered above Asia. When Europe was inhabited by a race of cannibals, a race of savages, naked men, heathens, and pagans, Africa was peopled with a race of cultured black men who were the masters in the arts, science, and literature, men who were cultured and refined, men who, it was said, were like the gods. Even the great poets of old sang in beautiful sonnets of the delight it afforded the gods to be in companionship with the Ethiopians. Why then should we lose hope? The reason for the great teacher's insistence on knowledge of Black history was to confute the lies of the white propagandists who pretend that the African was a man without history and had never advanced beyond the stage of primitive savagery except under the tutelage of other races. His views are very clearly stated. To read the histories of the world, peoples, and races written by white men would make the Negro feel and believe that he never amounted to anything in the creation. History is written with prejudices, likes, and dislikes, and there has never been a white historian who wrote with any true love or feeling for the Negro. The Negro should expect but very little by way of compliment from the pen of other races. It is essential for the African nationalist to be familiar with the history of the continent in order to ground his legitimate claim to the mother continent of our race. Both the Arabs and the Berbers in the North and the Western Europeans in the South are invaders and usurpers. The fact that the theft and exploitation have been hollowed by time has no relevance to the man with black skin and woolly hair, who, because of his familiarity with his history, knows that he, and he alone, has the right to the title African. Marcus Garvey realized that the judgment of history awarded Africa to our race and that it was our God given right to occupy the land and reconstruct the glories of our ancestors in this time and age. It is difficult for a man to know where he is going to if he does not know where he is coming from. An important concept of Garveyism was pride in the Black race. Marcus Garvey never permitted advertisements for bleaching creams and hair straightening in his paper, The Negro World. He called on the people of his race to respect their own kind of beauty, to accept the shape of their lips and noses, and to appreciate the woolly hair of the African. Take down the pictures of white women from your walls. Elevate your own women to that place of honor. They are, for the most part, the burden bearers of the race. Mothers, give your children child dolls that look like them to cuddle and play with. They will learn as they grow older to love and care for their own children and not neglect them. Men and women, God made us as his perfect creation. He made no mistake when he made us black with kinky hair. It was divine purpose for us to live in our natural habitat, the tropical zones of the earth. Forget the white man's banter that he made us in the night and forgot to paint us white. That he was that we were brought here against our will is just a natural process of the strong enslaving the weak. We have outgrown slavery, but our minds are still enslaved to thinking that they are the master race. Now take these kinks out of your mind instead of out of your hair. In furtherance of his belief in Black pride, Garvey was instrumental in producing Black dolls for African children in the United States. He, more than any other mass leader, understood the need for early indoctrination of the youth. In his campaign for Black Pride, Marcus Garvey was always inveighed against miscegenation, which he considered a sure way to race suicide. The statement, "What We Believe," which appeared over his signature in January 1924, is revealing. The Universal Negro Improvement Association advocates the uniting and blending of all Negroes into one strong, healthy race. It is against miscegenation and race suicide. It believes that the Negro race is as good as any other, and therefore should be as proud of itself as others are. It believes in the purity of the Negro race and the purity of the white race. It is against rich blacks marrying poor whites. It is against rich or poor whites taking advantage of Negro women. It was this insistence on race pride and race purity, as far as that was possible, which earned him many enemies among the black upper class. However, these very views, which he expounded so forcefully, have been the reason why he is today considered by many people of African origin as the father of Black pride. In the world of Garvey's time, contempt for Black skin and African hair was the norm. His pioneering work was assailing the belief in European standards of beauty and the acceptance of African features as born of a rich harvest in today's world. The Constitution of the Universal Negro Improvement Association was a lucid and comprehensive document. One of the doctrines which its provisions clearly expressed was that the Black organization should be racially exclusive. No Black organization was valid in the race struggle if it included non-Africans in its membership. In fact, the Constitution expressly stated that no high office in the organization could be held by a Negro who was married to a person of alien race. There was no doubt of the separate nature of the Garvey movement. Even in every strong nationalism which the world has witnessed, there has been an element of racial exclusiveness and a desire for national privacy. Garveyism clearly laid down the basic principles of Black power, but that the Black man must create himself his own Black institutions under Black leadership. Marcus Garvey poured contempt on those Black organizations which existed on the philanthropy of the white liberal and which were always proud to state the white gentlemen and ladies who were associated with them in their good work. He realized that these bigger organizations had not been created by the sacrifice and dedication of their own people, and as they were manipulated by the whites who financed them, were practically useless in the cause of African redemption and race uplift. The correctness of his analysis and outlook cannot be doubted now. Any race unable to build and create by its own genius, perseverance, and ability is unfit to claim equality to other peoples and races that have so built and so created. The white man has always reviled the Black man because in recent times, the Black man has not been able to create a modern, efficient nation of his own. Yet many so-called intellectuals of the African race state unequivocally that we can do nothing without the help and assistance of the European. Marcus Garvey always derided such self-defeating philosophy and maintained until his death that the Black man's only salvation was to create his own great nation, by dint of his own efforts in his motherland of Africa. I know no national boundary where the Negro is concerned, he said. Garvey was stating his firm belief that the problem of the black man was universal, in that all peoples of African stock suffered to greater or lesser degree at the hands of alien races. Hence, their salvation could not depend on national boundaries. In addition, the black man had not delineated these national boundaries, nor had he placed himself within them. He was therefore under no duty to respect them. Marcus Garvey's philosophy and thinking was for the entire black race. He was the first truly international African. He saw the condition of the race was unaffected by national situations. All stronger racial groups were prepared to give the Negro a kick in the pants. To correct his universal racial imbalance, the black man needed black unity in the national and international sense. Black movements had to be created which transcended national boundaries and which set the entire race about the task of racial reconstruction. Toward the end of the Negro world, the chief propaganda instrument of the Garvey movement was published in English, Spanish, and French. It reached out to Black communities all over the world and was smuggled into the interior of Africa where it was forbidden reading. The imperialists of Britain, France, and Portugal were afraid of the effect of the inflammatory doctrines of the Garvey movement on the populations of their African colonies. It was the unscrupulous machinations of these European bandits which aborted the colonization scheme of Marcus Garvey in Liberia, land which had been designated for settlement by Garveyites was afterwards handed over to the white American rubber king Firestone. The Garvey movement was and remains the greatest international movement of the African race in modern times. From the beginning to the end, it was international in conception and scope. Marcus Garvey preached unity of the national communities of those African stock. This was concomitant with racial solidarity on the global scale. The kernel of Garveyism consisted of his unyielding belief that the salvation of the race demanded the creation of a great nation in Africa capable of spreading its protective umbrella over all the African peoples scattered across the world in the great Black diaspora. This was the fifth basic concept of Garvey philosophy. To put it in modern language, the Black man must do his own big thing in his home base, Africa. This fundamental of Garveyism may be best expressed in his own words. For 5 years, the Universal Negro Improvement Association has been advocating the cause of Africa for the Africans. That is, that the Negro peoples of the world should concentrate upon the object of building up for themselves a great nation in Africa. Races and people are only safeguarded when they are strong enough to protect themselves. And that is why we appeal to the 400 million Negroes of the world to come together for self protection and self preservation. We do not want what belongs to the great white race or the yellow race. We only want those things that belong to the black race. Africa is ours. To win Africa, we will give up America. We will give up our claim in all other parts of the world, but we must have Africa. We will give up the vain desire of having a seat in the White House in America, of having a seat in the House of Lords in England, of being president of France for the chance and opportunity of fulfilling these positions in a country of our own. In his poem, Hail, United States of Africa, written in 1926 in the Atlanta prison, Garvey expressed the ideals of all African unity and foresaw the need for an African superstate when most Black leaders at the time were wallowing in the morass of tribalism and communal isolationism. His vision of Africa was prophetic to an uncanny degree. In his home country of Jamaica, he is considered by many for these and other reasons to have been a combination of a prophet and seer. His great battle cry, Africa for the Africans, those at home and those abroad, resounded around the African world and remained to stimulate and dynamize such African nationalists as Kwame Nkrumah and Numadi Arakiri. Although the United States of Africa has not yet materialized, the Organization of African Unity is a small step in the right direction, which gives great hope to the oppressed people of the African race everywhere. We now turn to Garvey's concept of God. What is or what can our concept of God be our concept of God? Every race and every people who have emerged since the beginning of time have had some concept of a god or gods. In every case, a people has sought a religion which gives them strength and points them in a direction of positive achievement. No race or people have made any impact on the world who have allowed themselves to become enslaved to a religion which made them nothing. Those people who have conquered, those people who have built civilizations, are people who have had a religion which made them strong, which made them positive, which enabled them to assert themselves. We cannot have a religion which tells us that we are inferior, which tells us that we must remain in the place in which the Lord has allotted us. Such a religion, such a God, ensures that we will be slaves and inferior to another race and another people. Our God must make us strong. Our God must heed our every need and every purpose. Otherwise, he is not our God. Marcus Garvey understood this, and when he spoke, his words led us directly to the concept of the Black God. If the white man has the idea of a white God, let him worship his God as he desires. If the yellow man's God is of his race, let him worship his God as he sees fit. We, as Negroes, have found a new ideal. Whilst our God has no color, yet it is human to see everything through one's own spectacles. And since the white people have seen their God through white spectacles, we have only now started out, late though it may be, to see our God through our own spectacles. The God of Isaac and the God of Jacob, let him exist for the race that believes in the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. We Negroes believe in the God of Ethiopia, the everlasting God, God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Ghost, the one God of all ages. That is the God in whom we believe, but we shall worship him through the spectacles of Ethiopia. The belief in the God of Africa and the Black race, who has created his Black sons and daughters in his own image and likeness, was an essential part of the total philosophy of Garveyism. Just as the white man uses all the external paraphernalia of his religion, so must we Africans do likewise. Each race or people since prehistoric times has visualized its God as having a physical form corresponding to their own. It is only the inferior race which worships an alien God. Marcus Garvey taught us to see our God through the spectacles of Ethiopia, and it was for this reason that he, together with the Archbishop Maguire, raised the Black Christ and the Black Madonna of the African Orthodox Church. If we follow the great teacher, then we accept that the African must have a theology rooted in his own ancestry and heritage and illustrated in conformity with his own physical appearance. In the second half of the decade beginning in 1960, a powerful cry rose from the oppressed Africans of the United States of America, a cry that reverberated around the world and set in motion changes in speech, dress, and thought that are even now continuing. This cry was for Black power. It answered the needs of Black people in the 60s, just as the thunder of Garveyism had answered the needs of Blacks in the 20s. What is the real difference between these two philosophies? The answer is that both doctrines coincide to an amazing extent, but Garveyism emphasizes far more than Black power. Garveyism stresses the need for a nation in Africa as part of the final solution. Marcus Garvey realized that the minority group's existence in countries at the whim and fancy of the majority, and that irrespective of the temporary achievement of the group, they could not be dispossessed and despoiled if they did not have a powerful home nation to protect them when the majority coveted or envied their supposed advances. The fate of the Jews at different times in their long history of vagrancy is eloquent and a sad testimony of this fact. Black power has now spread from the United States to the islands of the Caribbean and will eventually make its presence felt in the mother continent, Africa. Each community has tended to give its own interpretation to Black power ideas. The result is that the original ideas propounded by Carmichael, Hamilton, and others have been transformed to concepts which after appear stupid, ineffective, and negativistic. This is, of course, because so many opportunists have tried to mount the Black Power bandwagon. Black Power, with its strident demand for local power in the Black community, has seemed to many a panacea for the ills of the Black man. But it must be realized that any solution in which is not based on the creation of an African superstate equipped with modern weaponry and disposing massive military force is no solution at all. Marcus Garvey preached Black pride. He called to Black people to acquaint themselves with their glorious history and to take pride in their culture. He, at all times, propounded Black institutions financed by Black people. He was an unrepentant separatist. He said, "A race without authority and power is a race without respect, and the power is the only argument that satisfies man, except the individual, the race, or the nation has power that is exclusive. It means that that individual race or nation will be bound by the will of the other who possesses this great qualification." Hence, it is advisable for the Negro to get power of every kind. It is not too much, then, to say that he was the first and original exponent of Black power. The high noon of Garveyism was 1919 to 1925. Marcus Garvey died in 1940. Let us consider the relevance of Garveyism at the present time. The integrationists and the self seekers are always quick to point out the gains of the Black man in the United States and the rash of small independent countries in Africa and the Caribbean as major advances since Garvey's day. They then proceed to say that much of what Garvey worked for has already been obtained, so that his philosophies are irrelevant in the present improved situation, and that we shall overcome the remaining obstacles to racial progress in due course. This is, to my mind, a load of rubbish. Marcus Garvey would not be impressed by the Black man's situation in the world today. He would still ask, where are the Black man's armies? Where are his navies? Where are his men of great affairs? The answers must be that the Black man has no significant armies or navies which are worthy of note, and that his men of great affairs are usually to be found in the antechamber of powerful white men begging for loans, alms, and grants in aid. Despite the fact of independence, the African in today's world finds himself under the control of men of an alien race. In the so-called independent countries, in the so-called independent countries of Africa and the Caribbean, searching questions reveal the powerlessness of the African in his own countries where he is an undisputed majority. Who owns the new skyscrapers that are being built? Who owns the banks? Who owns the industries? Who owns and dominates commerce? The white man, the yellow man, or the East Indian brown man? The identity of the dominant minority groups may vary from country to country, but the basic situation is the same whether in Kenya, Ghana, Jamaica, or Trinidad. The Black man, the African, works for another racial group who owns and dominate the economy and skim the cream of the major share of wealth for their own kind. The African everywhere suffers from what Kwame Nkrumah called neocolonialism. In the United States and the South and Central Americas, the African remains at the bottom of the social scale. He is crammed into the crumbling ghettos and is the victim of mortality rates, which are always much higher than in the surrounding white communities with their superior living standards. Drug addiction, unhealthy living conditions, communal crime, and inferior education keep the Blacks of the Americas in general situations of degradation and inferiority. Garveyism was relevant to the oppressed Blacks of the 20s. I submit that it is equally relevant to the oppressed Blacks of the 70s. In addition, the emergence of two superpowers in the USA and the USSR, which we would today call Russia, and the coming emergence of another, the People's Republic of China, witnessed the foresight of the great teacher of African nationalism. If it was necessary for the Black man to create a great nation in Africa in 1920, then it is even more necessary for him to do so in 1970. The white man has the USA and the USSR. The yellow man has Russia. The brown man has India. Where is the Black man's massive and monolithic political entity? Garveyism demands that we set about creating one now. At the time that Garvey formulated his ideas, capitalism appeared to be the form and communism the aberration therefrom. 50 years later, we have witnessed the tremendous changes wrought in the Soviet Union and China by communist methods of social and economic organization. However, communism has not proved to be an undulated blessing. Production has lagged in agriculture, and in the Soviet Union, capitalist incentives have had to be adopted where communist idealism has failed. Regimentation and the curtailment of individual freedoms have been a part of the price for rapid industrialization and military power. The African has noted the failures of capitalism and communism. He must, I think, seek his own middle road, which can help him to build the powerful superstate that is our only salvation. The solution, as I see it, lies in linking the African nationalism of my father to an African socialism based on principles rooted in our African culture and heritage. This compound doctrine may properly be called African National Socialism. It constitutes a total philosophy for the African race and is applicable to Black communities throughout the world. The newly independent nations of Africa and the Caribbean have, in the years since independence, failed to satisfy the high expectations of their peoples. A few who have worked with the neocolonialists have prospered off of the prerequisites of office or have managed to amass wealth by dubious means. The remainder have been at the mercy of steeply rising prices in the midst of chronic unemployment. Wealth and ownership have been concentrated in too few hands. A race or people cannot expect salvation from doctrines formulated by alien races for their own peculiar environment and circumstances. Neither atheistic communism nor monopoly capitalism will provide the Black man with an African paradise. What is the nature then of the African socialism which I predicate? The basic idea is that the wealth of the Black community should be in the hands of Black people. Too many Black doctrinaire thinkers have sent themselves into tenuous tantrums worrying about the division of economic cake which the Black man does not possess anywhere in the world. Our first job is to seize the cake from the alien races who have so far been happy to leave us with the crumbs. This can be accomplished in independent African countries, whether in the Caribbean or in Africa, by economic boycott of business interests owned by minority non-African groups. Another effective method is to restrict activity in certain lucrative fields by trade licensing and the grant of these licenses only to Africans. Government contracts would also be limited in certain cases to African firms. Finally, nationalization should be used to deal with large undertakings. In countries of the Caribbean, it would be legitimate to expropriate English, Canadian, and American holdings as compensation for the slave labor of our African ancestors. The Jews received reparations from Germany. It is time that we Africans got our reparations from the Western white man. If the Black man controls the economy, it is then appropriate to think of models for the distribution of wealth and the ownership of property. It was natural for our African ancestors to consider that grazing and hunting land should be held for the tribe and should not be abrogated to the individual or the family. But at the same time, they appreciated private ownership of certain items of wealth. Thus, state ownership on behalf of the people of the nation is a legitimate concept of African socialism. Equally, people's cooperatives covering a wide range of industry, commerce, and agriculture are an inherent part of the system. The aims must be to reduce exploitation of man by man, to enforce a leveling of individual incomes by reducing wide disparities, and to place the major means of production in the control of the workers and peasants through their government agencies and cooperatives. At the same time, the total abolition of individual ownership would have a stifling effect on personal initiative and effort and would retard the development of small enterprises which depend on individual enterprise and personal service. This would be a ridiculous example of doctrinaire thinking at a time when the Black people need to mobilize their total resources by all means possible for rapid development. It is convenient, therefore, to consider all activity divided into large, intermediate, and small scale enterprises. There would then be state ownership of all large scale enterprises and those other enterprises vital to national security. Individual ownership of small scale enterprises would be permitted, and there would be an overlap between state and cooperative ownership in the immediate range. In all cases, worker participation and ownership should be accepted. African socialism should be flexible and pragmatic. It should be based on the essential unity of the African family, our common history of suffering and degradation, and our need to complete the work of racial reconstruction. No philosophy can be all embracing and at the same time immutable. We live in an age when the rapid ebb and flow of climacteric events shape and reshape our contemporary world with bewildering rapidity. Garveyism will adapt to this time by becoming part of the wider philosophy of African National Socialism. The Black man cannot sacrifice life and limb to a struggle against one form of oppression in order to fall into a Black system of inequality and minority privilege. The greatest good for the greatest number will still temper all revolutionary activity among Africans in the foreseeable future. That Garveyism can be absorbed almost intact into the wider philosophy speaks volumes for the genius of its creator. If there is one point at which we must diverge from the great teacher, it is in use of the appellation Negro. As African nationalists, only one word can be applied to the people of the dark skin and woolly hair: African. Let us speak in future of American Africans, Trinidadian Africans, and Brazilian Africans. It is time for the word Negro to die a natural death. African National Socialism postulates that the children of the Black God of Africa have a date with destiny. We shall recreate the glories of ancient Egypt, Ethiopia, and Nubia. It is natural that the children of Mother Africa, scattered in the great diaspora, will cleave together once more. It seems certain that the world will one day be faced with the Black cry for an African Anschluss and the resolute demand for an African Lebensstrahl. One God, one aim, one destiny for our glorious African race. And we're going to stop right there for tonight. I think that African National Socialism is an answer. I call it communalism, where you have internal communalism. Each group and small family operates as a business, and external capitalism, when you're dealing with aliens and foreigners. You have your prices low for those in your community, but when you're dealing in global markets, you have to deal with capitalist ideas. I think that Marcus Garvey Jr. had it right when he said that we need to come together and have, we need to stop giving our best and our brightest to the white man. We need to stop revering the white man's woman. Um, we need to stop thinking that anything that they have is better. I want to say greetings to the forecast, Anthony McPhail and Sister Ron, the elders listening with her. I'm sure Oni is out there. I'm sure Koku is out there. I'm sure Brother Bakari is out there somewhere. And so is Bawana Haguziki. I want to thank each and every one of you for tuning in today. I'd like to thank those that have supported this broadcast, which include Bawana Haguziki, Brother Bakari, the forecast, Sister Ron, the elders listening with her, Afro Native, Tinkerbell 87, Jesse's Kids Academy, and the Daycare Ladies Network. I want to thank each and every one of you for tuning in. We'll be back tomorrow night at 7 p.m. No, excuse me, Monday night at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to continue reading about the revival of Marcus Garvey. We'll be picking up on page 388. Thanks for tuning in. Peace, guys.